Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month, Straight Fallen Angel Harm Comfort. This is episode 488. I am Nobilis Reed. Our author, Stephen Guy, is the author of the erotic cosmic horror novella Starseed from Seventh Terrace Press, and many other things mostly written under another name. Our narrator is longtime friend of the podcast, Vivienne Ferrari, who I can always trust to come in for the clutch. I didn't mean it that way. Remember that you can get even more erotic audio if you join the Patreon campaign at patreon.com/nobilis. In addition, you'll get access to the podcast Discord and my undying gratitude. Here we go.
Leviathan by Stephen Guy. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook or press down his tongue with cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as a bird? Or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Job, chapter 41, verses 1 to 34. A week before Lent, a star fell from heaven. The light of its burning lit the sisters' bedroom through their window and woke them from a deep and dreamless sleep. Christine leapt from the bed and pressed her face to the window. "A miracle!" she cried. "A miracle that we should see a star fall." Her sister stayed by the bed and took to her knees in prayer. "It has landed not far," Christine shouted. "Perhaps in the pasture near to the river. Come, run, let us find it. A star falls from heaven. It will be of silver and gold. We are newly rich." Her sister shook her head and remained upon her knees. "It is an evil omen, sister," she whispered, "to see such a star fall. Close your eyes. Remember your prayers." But Christine took her sister by the hand and led her out, both still in the thin shifts they slept in. Spring was not yet in bloom, and it was cold. Their breath hung in 1,000 tiny crystals as they ran to the pasture near the river. The smell of smoke was in the air, and just as they ran out of breath and began to walk, they found a man. Or rather, they found a man of sorts. He lay on his side at the edge of a deep furrow that smelled both a little of wet earth and of a blacksmith's forge. The furrow was no doubt from the mighty fury of his fall, and he was unconscious and curled up like a child. His skin was a peculiar red in color. He seemed to be burnt or dyed to some shade between ochre and aubergine. His feet were blackened stumps, and his hands black too, save for his palms, which were the gray color of ash. On the whole, he looked charred, like the wood at the bottom of the charcoal-maker's pit, and yet his chest rose and fell. He was alive and breathed like a man. "Miraculous!" Christine shouted. "A miracle! A miracle! A miracle! A man has fallen from heaven! We must help him!" Her sister held back. "Christine," she said. "Sweet Christine. No man falls from heaven, but that he has been cast out. Look at him. He is a devil, if not the devil. Turn away. Turn away now." Christine was undeterred. "Help me, sister," she said, "and we will carry him back to the house and bathe him. Perhaps such lotions and ointments as we have, and some bread and milk and honey too, might restore him." She took her elder by her hand, and together they tried to lift him, but his weight was supernatural. His bones seemed to be cast of iron. Even together they could barely move him. Only such a man could survive a fall from heaven. At last the eldest went to get the donkey and the little flat-bottomed cart of the type often called a dray, and Christine waited with the man so recently fallen from heaven. Although he breathed steadily, he wakened not even when they finally, with great effort, lifted him up, and not even when they lay him on the dray. "We shall put him in the kitchen," said Christine, "and lay him on the table. There we will restore him with our bread and our milk, and maybe some of our unguents made from honey." "He is a devil," said the sister again. "Maybe the devil. We will put him on a bier of straw in the barn." Christine argued, but on this her sister would not relent. In the end they were so tired from lifting him onto the cart that they rolled him onto a heap of straw in the barn by tipping the cart. This still did not rouse him, and they left him where he lay. They locked the barn from the outside. The stars were fading in the pale blue light that precedes the dawn when they made their way back into their own kitchen. "I will bathe him after I am done my chores," said Christine. "I will use an unguent made from milk and honey. It is the best for burns." "You will do no such thing," said her sister. "You leave him locked in the barn. You will not hear him if he speaks, nor listen if he cries. Many are the tricks of fallen angels, and their lies are sophisticated. I will go now and hitch the donkey to the cart. The old iron wheels for the cart rest against the wall of the barn. I will take them into town, there to have the blacksmith forge them into manacles. While the blacksmith does this necessary work, I will seek the priest and tell him of what we have seen and done here. When the manacles are made, I'll be back with the priest. He will bring the holy book and vials of holy water. He will know what to do. Until then, you tend to the hens and furrow the garden for planting. But cover your ears and let not your eyes look to the barn. I'll be back in 3 days' time. If by chance he should escape, run to the river as fast as you can. It is said that those cast out of heaven are soulless and cannot cross running water. Run if you must. Run and brave the water. It is all I can think to tell you." Christine nodded, then watched as her elder sister left with the donkey, the cart, and the iron wheels. She returned to lay in their bed a while, cooling in the absence of her sister's warmth. When she slept, she dreamt, and when she dreamt of a swarm of bees. They danced upon her hands. They traced the soles of their feet along her belly. From where their light feet touched, a strange warmth spread, and she blushed. Feeling herself blush, she became giddy, and she laughed herself awake. She awoke mid-morning, rising much later than if her sister had been there. She dressed and drew water from the well, cold and sweet, and took up a jar of the unguent made of milk and honey, the best for treating burns, and walked to the barn. She unbarred the door and let herself in without knocking. There her patient lay on his bier of straw, still breathing and still asleep. He had now moved onto his back and stretched out, his legs long below him, his arms high above him. She looked at him and saw the feet, blackened and almost stumps, and the palms of his hands the color of ash. His body was the color of rich earth, and his hair a lightless black. In the center of his body, in between his legs, his manhood lay, his phallus. It too seemed to be blackened. It was like driftwood, knotty, or maybe like charcoal, she thought, burnt and uneven. She could not decide. Christine had grown up on a farm, so she was no stranger to the male of the species. She had seen the ram in the field. She had seen the cock with the hens, but none had ever appeared to her like this. She shook her head and set down the cool water and opened the unguent. With her hands, she spread the unguent first upon his feet. They felt as cold and hard as a stone lifted up from the river, even after the heat of his fall. She held first one foot and then the other. She rounded each heel with the unguent in her palms, and felt that perhaps his feet had not been burned so much as he had been afflicted with a club-foot, or had been cruelly lamed at some point. He had no toes to speak of. He was all heel and sole. She pitied him. She moved to his hands, to his palms of ash. With her own small hands, she worked the unguent into his palms, then through his fingers, twining them with hers as she needed in order to apply the balm. She marveled at his hands, so big and so heavy with what she thought must be the strength of giants. She thought that he must have great and terrible power in his hands, and that in his grip there would be no escape. The proportions were perfect. Done balming his hands, she lay one of her hands in his, the back of her hand to his palm, and saw that had he closed his, it would easily have covered hers. She thought of his hands upon her, as if he might toss her into the air, and she felt again the soft tread of the bees on her belly, the sensation of being caught up in some type of sorcerous levitation, and she laughed. His hands balmed, she set the lid upon the unguent and made to leave. She walked to the barn door and then looked back upon him, and still he lay as she had found him, his legs below him, his arms above his head, the long and knotty phallus resting against his darkened thigh. She wondered if it might reach to his navel if made to lie that way, and without thinking it checked over her shoulder for her sister. She blushed at herself for this, and then, quietly, holding her breath, walked back to the man so recently fallen from heaven. Once again she balmed her hands with the unguent. She took up his darkened cock with both hands. The length of it she massaged with unguent, slowly at first, then faster. There was some magic in this, some miracle of healing, for she felt him stiffen in her hands and become long. Indeed, he was the length of both of her hands and more, and so thick that she could not close her thumb and forefinger around him. With both hands, one against the other, she'd go up his length, then back down. Again, with both hands, this time fingertip to encircle him, she stroked along the length of him, from the base of wicked thing all the way to the tip, feeling for some place where she might close the circle of her hands at the completion of her stroke. She repeated this until she could see the unguent take effect. His skin would glisten, and the glands of his phallus would shine. He moved in his sleep and sighed. His hips raised up from the bier and then rested again, but his eyes did not open. She watched him then, both hands on him, slick with the unguent. The air smelled of straw and of honey, and a little of her breath, and a little of his fire. When he settled, she once again balmed him with her hands, up and down, the thumb and forefinger of each hand striving to meet in turn, and soon again he sighed, and his hips rose up. She did not stop this time, for she felt the blood of his heart beating through his cock in her hands, and in feeling it she felt the bees upon her belly again, and they urged her on and propelled her to quickness. She made her hands faster by running her thumbs along the underside of his cock, the whole of which gave off a pleasant warmth. From the base she'd run her thumbs up and up, up along the soft channel at the underside of the tip, and then repeat, each time a little quicker than the last. He raised his hips now and did lower them. He sighed continuously, and his breathing became heavy before it stopped all at once, and his hot white issue came forth from his cock in spasms, once like a fountain, a second time like rain, and then a third like the last cup from an ewer. His issue shone hot upon her hands and wrists, and even on her dress, and it ran down her arms and spilled to the ground at her feet. She ran the thumb of her right hand along the underside of the great and throbbing thing, and followed it with the circle of thumb and forefinger of her left, milking the last of his semen from him until she could draw no more, satisfied that all of his issue was spent, and there was none left but what was on her, on him, or on the ground. He covered his head with his arms and turned to the wall next to the bier, his breathing deep and slow. She left him then, and barred the door when she exited the barn. She cleaned her hands, her wrists, and her arms at the pump at the well. Above the smell of the unguent, the honey and the milk, she could smell his issue and thought it smelled faintly not of heaven or fire, but of earth, and even more faintly of the sea. She finished her chores and returned to her bed, the bed cold in the absence of her sister. When she slept, she dreamt, and in her dream was visited by a plague of frogs. They came up from the river and climbed the trees and filled the garden, chirping in 1,000 times 1,000 joyous voices. They copulated in the well, in pairs and in trios and in clusters, white-bellied and green-backed, and nothing could be heard above their ecstatic songs. She woke late in the morning the next day, the sun already near to noon. She dressed as fast as she could, but left her hair unbound. She did not put on her shoes. She gathered up the unguent of honey, milk, and cinnamon too, then ran to the barn, stopping only to fill the bucket half full at the pump. She slipped into the barn without bothering to be too quiet, and saw the man so recently fallen from heaven asleep on his bier. His back was to her, and she saw great welts on his shoulders and another at the base of his spine. Moved to pity, she went barefoot to him, and with little delay spread the balm upon her hands, and went to work on the welts above his shoulders and the welt at the base of his spine. His color was better, she thought, a more even red, although his legs below the thigh remained a dark brown, so dark it might be called black. His breathing coursed through his body evenly now, and she prayed that he might be healing. Done with his back and shoulders, she put the lid on the unguent, and quietly, because of her bare feet, she stepped back into the shadows by the door. There she stood and watched him a while, breathing deeply and slowly herself. The noonday sun had passed, and because the barn door faced east, as was the custom in those parts, she was soon in darkness and he only half lit. He stirred then with the shade, and rolled over and turned to her, sitting up on his bier for the first time. His weight was upon his hands, his eyes upon the floor. His legs were apart, and against his great burnished thigh rested his phallus again. She could see that the anointing she had rendered to him the day before had been of some effect, for his cock was even thicker, fuller and longer than she had remembered. It was now the color of cedar at the base, but still as black as mahogany towards the heavy tip. What she had thought to be the scoring and welts born of fire on it before, she now saw to be veins thick and veins thin, some knotty and some slight. In her mind's eye she traced them with her fingertips, and when she did, she imagined that she felt it jump to her touch, rising and becoming tumescent, standing up to his belly with a gentle upward curve. He looked up from the floor to her and held her gaze, his eyes as black as the bottom of a well. "Where is your father?" he asked. His voice was gentle and low, less a question than a confidence whispered in her ear. "Dead of a winter fever these 2 years past," she spoke. Her voice was thin. "Your mother?" he asked, his voice even more gentle, and with its gentleness she felt the bees soft upon her belly again. "Dead these many years," she said, "giving birth to me." "Are you alone here?" he asked. He spoke softly. He made no demand. "For now," she answered. "My sister is here, but she is gone to town now, and returns in a day hence." "Why does she leave you here, then?" he asked. "She takes what iron we had to the smith, and while he forges, she will fetch the priest," she answered. Her voice was low, her eyes averted. He said nothing for a time, then rose from his bier. His feet, where she had thought him to be burned, she saw to be cloven now, the cloven hoofs that marked the infernal. His cock was as she imagined now, dark brown and hard, so hard, and it rose up to the middle of his belly with the strength and curve of a pagan sword. He took her hands in his and placed them in his hands, and then when he saw that she could not look at him or his devil cock, he placed her hands on it. "The priest comes with a book, I imagine," he said, "with words in a dead language and fear in his heart. The blacksmith comes too, and he comes with chains of cold iron." He laughed after he spoke, laughed deep and long. Both hands upon his erection, she looked up and held his eye. "How far did you fall?" she asked him. "When you were cast out?" He laughed again and then was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, he said, "I fell more for a great time than I did for a long distance. I fell for the measure of lives, the lives of generations, and of the span of the eons needed for the gathering of great hosts and the rise and fall of mighty nations uncounted." With that he pressed his cock firmly against her hands with the strength of his hips and legs. "Come now," he said, his voice softer than a bee landing on the flower. "The balm is sweet, and its fragrance rises to please even heaven, but the healing is in your hands." She strove now, deliberately rough with her hands, and with all her strength tried to close her thumb and forefinger around his width. Faster now she moved from base to tip, firmer now the pad of her thumb in the channel at the base of his beautiful head. She cupped the great oval testicles in one hand and pulled them gently away from his body, and they too jumped to her touch and grew soft and smooth with the unguent. He sighed and reached above his head to steady himself on a beam, and then cried out as his hips strained towards her. She stopped, and for a brief moment he leaned into her, arched like his back might break should he lose his grip upon the beams, and he cried out words in some unknown language. She could not decipher a word from him, or even speak for herself. It seemed as if the only sounds she could hear were those of her hands upon his cock, and the chorus and cadence of the mating frogs from her dream. In her hands, and with the chorus, he seemed to swell even more, and this drove the circle of her thumb and forefinger even farther apart, and she fought to close the gap. She fought by squeezing as hard as she could with both hands from the base to the tip, and she heard him stop breathing after a last sharp gasp, and felt the first hot liquid drop as his issue came forth from his cockhead. From this single drop, moon-white and as warm as blood, the stream of his issue came as it had before, except in an even larger flood. Once as a great fountain, a second time as torrential rain, a third as the last draught to spill from a pitcher. His issue ran warm upon her hands and wrists, and even her neck and chest, where it ran down between her breasts and settled near her navel. She ran the thumb of her right hand along the underside of his cock, and followed it with the circle of thumb and forefinger of her left, until she could draw no more from him, until all of his issue was spent and on her, or on him, or on the ground, and still his cock strove against her hand, jumped to her touch.
"Yes,"
he said, so softly she was not at first sure he had spoken.
"Yes, many are the miracles of the world, but the healing is in your hands."
She left him then and barred the barn door again. She went to the well to draw water to clean herself with. She held her wrist to her mouth, and with the fullness of her tongue tasted his issue and swallowed it, and she thought it tasted more strongly of the sea than of earth, and that for this he must be for the healing she had performed upon him. She cleaned herself, and did not bother with the rest of her chores, but instead went to her bed, now warm from the sun even in the absence of her sister's body. She lay there for a long time, her shift above her knees, her right hand in her unbound hair. When at last she slept, she dreamt, and in the dream she waded into the ocean, and there felt the stirring of the great world-serpent that sleeps beneath the deepest deeps. Leviathan he is called, and he rests as the Lord has decreed, until he is roused and the end of the world is nigh. Christine stood in the ocean with her feet wet, when Leviathan stirred softly in his own unknowable dreams, and broke the sea a little. The waves came towards her in intervals, and climbed her legs to her knees, and then washed over her knees to her thighs, until at last strongest came, and washed over her thighs to her waist just below her navel. She stood in the ocean, holding her shift up above her waist with both her hands. The hem of the garment was damp and soft from the waves of Leviathan, and she looked to the sky to see if she might see his reflection in the firmament. As above, so below, it is said, and so she hoped that she might see. This is what she dreamt. She awoke the next in the late afternoon and walked to the barn. The hens had scattered looking for grain, and the cows lowed anxiously for their hay. No water did she draw from the well for any animal, or for herself, instead bringing only the last of the honey and milk. She walked to the barn door, but stood back for some time, and noted the arc of the sun in the sky. There were no birds in flight, no current of air. All was dead and calm. Her hair hung to her shoulders, and her feet were bare. In this, the quietest of moments, She heard the man fallen from heaven stir upon his bier, and heard his voice, like a chorus of frogs, like the buzzing of bees, whisper to her.
"Come to me," he said. "Come with your soft hands and your velvet touch. I want to give you what you give to me. Come."
She raised the bar and slipped into the barn, one hand holding up her dress so as not to drag the hem upon the dirt floor. In the fading light he stood, and she could see that the days of rest and the application of her balm had made him perfect. Beautiful, he stood upon his cloven hooves. Beautiful, he stood made whole again. The welts on his back were wings now, great and black like the length of his phallus. The scoring at the base of his spine was healed too, replaced by a tail, black and scaled. She had never seen anything so beautiful. Not man, nor bull, nor ram, nor cock in the field. He had now become perfect. She stood and bathed in his voice, her hands in the folds of her dress lifting it above the floor, above her knees. In one great step he strode towards her and seized her by her shoulders with the terrible strength in his great hands. She looked at the floor while he moved to set her upon the bier upon which he had so recently lain. Her dress was up to her belly now, and she rested one bare heel upon the bier, with the other on the floor, and she was open to him. While in his grasp she had dropped the small bowl of unguent, that balm of honey and milk, and it had run upon the floor in a warm and searching spread of liquid, and lay white upon the dark earth of the barn floor. He left Christine there, turning his back to her, and strode through the barn door, knocking it off of its hinges to lie in the yard before the well. 1, 2, 3 strides he took before vaulting into the air. He rose up into the sky, carried on his black and ancient wings, and only his cloven hoof prints in the soft earth of the yard remained to mark his presence. The drumbeat of his wings drove the birds of the air into the cover of the trees, and he passed through their circuits and beyond their heights in a strange and particular silence. Christine came out from the barn then, unsteady on her feet, her hands holding the hem of her dress. She watched him rise into the firmament, until at last only a red star, one that had not been there before, showed him to her. She walked along after him, her eyes on the distant and dimming light of his body, until at last she walked into the river, the water of which runs into the distant sea. There she heard her sister call her from the bridge, and heard the ringing of the blacksmith's iron chains with her sister's call. Then, too, she heard the baritone intonations of the priest chanting the Latin instructions from his holy book. But she did not take her eyes from that red light in the sky. Instead, she held the hem of her skirt up higher and waded deeper into the river, until at last the water rose past her knees and climbed up to her thighs, and then, gently with the tempo of the movement in the water, above them. There she stood and held her breath while the water came in the smallest of waves, faster and faster against her, stuttering a little before finding a steady rhythm, the waves coming from Leviathan, lying in the lightless abyss, and moving only a little in primordial slumber, and dreaming dreams unknown far away and at unimaginable depths. The end.
And that's our story. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this podcast, head to patreon.com/Nobilis. As a supporter, you will have access to a personal RSS feed that you can drop into your podcatcher. And if you want bonus content every month, bump up your support to $3 a month. Remember to pick up Monster Whisperer Second Class in your favorite ebook retailer or on the Riverdale Avenue Books website, or pick up the audiobook on Audible, Amazon, or Apple. Your support will help ensure this series continues. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.